Losing my parents at age 11 felt like the end of my life. When Uncle Bob arrived and asked me to stay with his family, it seemed as if God had finally sent me an angel. After all, he was family, or so everyone said. Little did I know he was destined to be the weapon fashioned against me.
I told you bringing this girl to our house will only bring bad luck.
You should be happy, Atisha.
Oh.
I found you a husband, and you ungrateful witch.
Hi, and welcome back to another series on gentle stories. Today we will be listening to the story of Jane, an orphan sold by her own family because of jealousy. Before we dive in, please tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Like and share this video as it helps us bring you more amazing stories. You see me now, and you see a woman who is happy and at peace. But I want you to know that it wasn't always this way. I wasn't born into wealth or comfort. My story starts in a place where I felt invisible, a place where I was surrounded by people who shared my blood but didn't have a single drop of love for me. I lost my parents when I was only 11 years old. One night, everything I knew was gone. My home, my toys, and the two people who loved me most in the world. I was just a child, and I was terrified. My Uncle Bob and Aunt Mary took me in, but they didn't do it because they cared. They did it because they felt they had to, and they made sure I paid for that kindness every single day of my life. By the time I was 19, I didn't feel like a niece anymore. I felt like a machine. My day always started in the dark. While the rest of the house was warm and dreaming, I was on my feet. I can still feel the cold of the kitchen floor on my bare feet. I had to fetch the water, start the fire, and make sure breakfast was ready before any of them opened their eyes. If I was even a minute late, I wouldn't hear the end of it. My cousins, Kate and Rose, were about my age, but we lived in two different worlds. They spent their days looking in the mirror, trying on new clothes, and talking about the rich men they wanted to marry. I spent my days scrubbing their dirt off the floors. They would walk right past me while I was on my knees, sometimes even stepping on my fingers on purpose just to see if I would cry. They called me the girl in the shadows. They told me I was lucky to even have a roof over my head. "Jane, get over here and fix my dress." Kate would yell. "Jane, why is there dust on my shoes?" Rose would scream. I never yelled back. It wasn't because I was weak. It was because I chose not to be like them. I remembered what my mother told me before she died. She told me that no matter how much mud people throw at you, you don't have to become the mud. You can stay clean. So I would just nod, say, "Yes, Kate," and keep working. I found my joy in small things. I would talk to the birds while I hung the laundry. I would share my tiny bit of food with the stray cats behind the house. I lived in those shadows for years. I was the one who did everything, but I was the one who was never seen. I was the one who kept that house running, but I was never invited to sit at the table. To Uncle Bob, I was just a free worker. To Aunt Mary, I was a burden she wanted to get rid of. I used to look at the stars through the small window in my room and wonder if this was all life had for me. I felt like a seed buried deep in the dirt, wondering if I would ever see the sun. I didn't know it then, but the dirt I was living in was actually the very thing helping me grow. I was being tested, and I was about to find out that the shadows don't last forever. So I kept my head down and my heart guarded, living in those shadows just like I told you. But then things in the house began to change. The quiet street outside our gate started to fill up with the sound of expensive car engines. Word had gotten out that Uncle Bob was looking to marry off his daughters, and since he had a bit of a name in town, wealthy men from the city started showing up. Every morning was a scramble. Aunt Mary would spend hours painting Kate and Rose's faces and squeezing them into tight silk dresses that cost more than I would see in a year. She wanted them to look like queens so they could catch a rich husband. Me. I was the invisible hand behind it all. I was the one ironing those silks, polishing their jewelry, and spending all day in a hot kitchen baking snacks for the guests. When the suitors arrived, men in sharp suits with gold watches and big smiles, I was the one sent in to serve them. I would walk into the parlor with my head bowed, carrying a heavy tray of tea and cakes. I didn't have any makeup on. My dress was old, faded, and probably smelled like wood smoke from the stove. I never said a word unless someone asked me a question. I just did my job and tried to get back to the kitchen as fast as I could. But then the atmosphere in the room started to feel different. I could feel eyes on me. I'd be pouring tea and I'd notice a suitor stop talking to Kate just to watch how I moved. One afternoon, a very wealthy man, someone Aunt Mary had been dreaming of for Rose, actually stood up when I walked in. He looked right past Rose's expensive jewelry and looked at me. He asked Uncle Bob, "Who is this girl? There is something about her, a piece I haven't seen in this city." I felt my heart drop. I didn't want the attention. I knew what it would cost me. Uncle Bob coughed, looking embarrassed, and Aunt Mary's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. "Oh, she's just a poor relative," Aunt Mary snapped, her voice like a whip. "She's a bit slow and clumsy. Jane, go back to the kitchen and stay there." I hurried out, but it was too late. The light had found me in the shadows and my aunt and uncle couldn't stand it. That evening, after the last suitor left without making a single proposal to my cousins, the house exploded. Aunt Mary marched into the kitchen where I was washing the mountain of dirty dishes. She grabbed a plate from my hand and threw it across the room. "You did this," she screamed. "You think you're so special with your quiet ways and your soft eyes. You were trying to steal the light from my daughters. You want to make them look loud and greedy just so those men will look at you." I stayed silent, my hands trembling in the soapy water. I hadn't done anything but serve tea, but in her mind my very existence was a threat. Uncle Bob walked in then, his face hard and cold. "Since you've become so proud that you think you can compete with your cousins," he said, "you will no longer be allowed in the parlor. You will stay in the backyard or the cellar when we have company." Then came the part that hurt the most. "And from tonight," Aunt Mary added with a mean smile, "you will not sit at the table with us. You will eat your scraps here on the floor where you belong." So that's how it became. While I heard them laughing and clinking glasses in the dining room, I sat on the cold kitchen floor, eating the leftovers they didn't want. They thought they were breaking me. They thought they were hiding my light. But sitting there in the dark, I realized that I would rather be alone with my dignity than sit at a table filled with hate. I didn't know it, but someone else was watching. Someone who didn't care about silk dresses or city titles. I learned to live with the silence of the kitchen floor. I accepted that my world had shrunk to the four walls of the scullery and the dirt of the backyard. My aunt and uncle thought they had finally hidden me away, but life has a funny way of opening doors just when you think they've been locked forever. One Saturday afternoon, while the sun was high and the air was heavy, I was out in the compound sweeping the dust. My back ached and my hands were dry, but I kept my rhythm. Suddenly, I heard the sound of the front gate creaking. I looked up and saw a man walking, or rather limping, into our yard. He was a sight that made my heart ache. His clothes were nothing but rags, covered in the dust of the road. He had a crooked hat pulled low over his eyes, and he leaned heavily on a wooden walking stick. He looked like he had walked across the entire world and found nothing but hardship. He looked like a man who had forgotten what a kind word felt like. My cousins, Kate and Rose, were sitting on the porch, fanning themselves and sipping cold lemonade. When they saw him, they didn't see a human being. They saw an eyesore. "Ugh, look at this trash!" Kate shouted, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Get out of here, you filthy beggar. We don't have any scraps for you today." Rose joined in, giggling behind her hand. "Go away before you bring fleas into our house. Uncle Bob, there's a stray at the gate." Uncle Bob came out, tying his robe over his stomach. He looked at the man with such disgust, you would have thought he was looking at a pile of garbage. "What do you want?" he barked. "We don't give handouts to lazy wanderers. Move along before I call the guards to throw you out." The man didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his head bowed, leaning on his stick. He looked so small and so tired. I couldn't just stand there and watch it. I forgot about the rules. I forgot that I was supposed to be invisible. I dropped my broom and walked over to the water tank. I filled a clean cup to the brim and walked toward him. I could feel Aunt Mary's eyes burning into my back from the window, and I knew I would pay for this later, but I didn't care. "Good afternoon, sir," I said softly as I reached him. I didn't look at his rags. I looked at his hands, which were surprisingly clean, and I looked at the way he stood. "You look like you've traveled a long way. Please take this water. It's cold." The man looked up then. For a second our eyes met under the brim of his hat. His eyes weren't the eyes of a broken man. They were sharp, calm, and deep, like he was looking right through my skin and into my soul. He took the cup and his fingers touched mine for a brief moment. He didn't snatch it. He took it with a grace that didn't match his clothes. "Thank you, Jane," he whispered. I froze. I hadn't told him my name. I stepped back, my heart thumping in my chest. How do you know who I am? He didn't answer. He just drank the water slowly, finished it, and handed the cup back to me with a small nod of respect. A kind heart is a rare thing in a house like this, he said, his voice steady and low. Jane, get back to your work. Uncle Bob roared from the porch. Stop wasting our water on people who don't matter. I hurried back to my broom, my face flushing. I didn't look back, but I could feel his gaze on me as he turned to speak to my uncle. I didn't know it then, but David wasn't just a wanderer looking for water. He was a man on a mission, and I had just passed the only test that mattered. I watched from the corner of the yard as that man, David, moved toward the porch to speak with my uncle. I kept my head down, pretending to sweep the same patch of dirt over and over, but I was listening. I was always listening. My uncle didn't even invite him onto the porch. He stood over him like a giant, looking down at David's dusty hat with a sneer that made my skin crawl. You've got a lot of nerve sticking around, Uncle Bob said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous tone he used when he was planning something mean. What could a man like you possibly want with a family like mine? I saw David lean on his walking stick. He didn't look afraid. I am looking for a wife, he said. His voice was so calm, so steady, it felt out of place in our loud, angry yard. I don't have much, but I have enough for a woman who is humble. I saw the girl who gave me water. I want her. I almost dropped my broom. My heart started hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Me. He wanted me. I looked at my uncle, expecting him to laugh and chase the man away. But instead, a slow, wicked smile spread across Uncle Bob's face. It was the kind of look he got when he figured out how to win a game. He looked at me, then back at David. I could see the wheels turning in his head. To him, this was the perfect plan. He could finally get rid of me, humiliate me in front of the whole town, and make sure that no wealthy suitor would ever come looking for me again. By marrying me off to a beggar, he was burying me alive. You want Jane? Uncle Bob asked, his voice dripping with fake kindness. Well, she's been a lot of trouble to us. A real burden. But I suppose if you're willing to take her off my hands, we could come to an agreement. They stepped into the small shade of the mango tree, away from where my cousins were sitting. David reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a small, worn envelope. He handed it to my uncle. Uncle Bob opened it quickly, his eyes lighting up as he counted the cash inside. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make him nod and stick the envelope deep into his pocket. He didn't ask me how I felt. He didn't ask if I wanted to go. He just shook the man's hand like they were trading a piece of old furniture or a goat at the market. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I was being sold. My own flesh and blood was trading my life for a small envelope of money just to be rid of the shadow I cast on his daughters. It's a deal, Uncle Bob said loudly, turning to look at me with a triumphant grin. Jane, stop that useless sweeping and come here. I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't look at David, I kept my eyes on the dirt. Pack your things, Uncle Bob barked. This man has agreed to take you. You're getting married in 2 weeks. No big party, no white dress. Just take your curse, and get out of my house. You're his problem now. I looked up at David then. He was watching me quietly. He didn't look like a man who had just bought a slave. He looked like a man who was waiting for me to see something he wasn't saying. But all I felt was the sting of betrayal. My uncle had sold my future to a stranger in rags just to satisfy his own pride. I walked back to my small room in silence, wondering if the life waiting for me on the road would be even darker than the one I was leaving behind. The days following that deal were a blur of tears and confusion. My uncle and aunt treated me like I was already gone, and my cousin spent every waking hour making fun of my beggar king. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how I would survive life on the streets. But then, a few days before the wedding, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about the man I was supposed to marry. It was late in the evening and I had been sent to the back of the yard to dump the ash from the stove. The moon was out, casting long, thin shadows across the dirt. As I turned to head back inside, I saw a figure sitting on a low stone wall near the edge of the property. It was David. He didn't see me at first. He was sitting perfectly straight, not hunched over like a man in pain, and he was holding something in his hands. I crept a little closer, my heart thumping. In the pale moonlight I saw that he was reading a book. It wasn't a thin pamphlet or a comic. It was a thick hardcover book with gold lettering on the spine. He was turning the pages with slow, deliberate fingers, his face focused and intense. I must have stepped on a dry twig because he looked up instantly. He didn't jump or act startled. He just closed the book and watched me approach. "You're awake late, Jane," he said. I froze. There was again that voice. It wasn't the rough, uneducated grunt of a man who had spent his life begging for scraps. It was clear, refined, and perfectly steady. I had work to do," I stammered, stepping into the light. "I didn't know you were still here. My uncle says you sleep under the trees in the square." David gave a small, knowing smile. "People see what they want to see, Jane. Your uncle sees a man he can look down on. Your aunt sees a way to hurt you. What do you see?" I looked at him, really looked at him. Even in those dusty rags there was a weight to him. He didn't have the eyes of someone who was hungry for food. He had the eyes of someone who held a great secret. "I don't know what I see," I whispered. "I see a man who reads books I can't afford. I see a man who speaks like a teacher but dresses like a ghost. Who are you, David? Why are you doing this to me?" He stood up then, and for a moment he forgot to limp. He stood tall, his shoulders broad and squared, looking like a man who was used to commanding a room. He stepped closer, but he was careful to give me space. "I am not doing this to you, Jane," he said softly. "I am doing this for us. I know you're afraid. I know they've spent years telling you that you're worth nothing more than the dirt on these floors. But they are wrong." He reached out, his hand hovering near mine for a second before he pulled it back. "You're gold, Jane. Pure gold. And gold doesn't lose its value just because it's covered in a little bit of dust. I promise you, when you leave this house with me, you will be safe. You will never have to scrub another floor out of fear again." "But how?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're a wanderer. We have nothing." "Trust me," he said, and his voice held such power that I almost believed him right then and there. "The world is much bigger than this little town, and I am much more than these old clothes. Just hold on for a few more days." He turned and walked back into the darkness, and as he did, he started to limp again. I stood there in the cold night air, holding the empty ash bucket, feeling like the ground was shifting under my feet. I didn't have an answer, but for the first time in years I didn't feel like a girl in the shadows. I felt like someone who was being waited for. Those words David spoke in the dark stayed with me, echoing in my head like a song I couldn't quite remember. "You are gold," he had said. I repeated it to myself every time Aunt Mary screamed at me during those final 2 weeks. I whispered it when my cousins tripped me in the hallway. I held on to it like a lifeline, even as the morning of the wedding finally arrived. But when the sun came up on that Saturday, it didn't feel like a day for gold. The sky was a dull, heavy gray, and the house felt colder than usual. There was no music playing. There were no colorful ribbons tied to the gate, and no smell of a feast cooking in the kitchen. In fact, Aunt Mary made sure I did the laundry before I was even allowed to get ready. "Don't think you're a princess just because you're a bride," she hissed, throwing a heavy plastic bag at my feet. "Get dressed quickly. We don't want to keep your king waiting in the dirt." I opened the bag with trembling hands. Inside was an old yellowed lace gown. It was torn at the shoulder and had a dark stain along the bottom hem that looked like old grease. It was a dress meant to shame me, a dress meant to tell the whole town that I was being thrown away. I put it on in my small room, looking at myself in the cracked mirror. I looked like a broken doll. When I walked out into the parlor, Kate and Rose were waiting. They were dressed in their finest Sunday clothes, looking at me with smirks that cut deeper than knives. "Look at her." Kate laughed, pointing at the tear in my sleeve. "You finally look like you belong with that beggar, Jane. I hope you're ready to sleep under a bridge. I heard it gets very cold this time of year." "Don't worry," Rose added, fanning herself. "Maybe if you stand on the street corner in that dress, people will feel so sorry for you that they'll give you an extra coin. You better get used to begging for your scraps now, because you'll never see a dining table again." I didn't say a word. I kept my back straight and my head held high, just like my mother taught me. My conscience was clear. I had worked hard, I had stayed kind, and I had honored the family that hated me. The ceremony was short and bitter. We stood in the dusty compound. There were no guests, just the pastor who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, and my uncle who was checking his watch every 2 minutes. David was there, wearing the same ragged coat and the same dusty hat. He looked at my stained dress, and for a moment, I saw a flash of anger in his eyes. Not at me, but at the people who had given it to me. Do you, David, take Jane to be your wife? The pastor asked, his voice flat. I do, David said. His voice was so loud and so firm that Uncle Bob actually blinked in surprise. And do you, Jane, take David? I looked at David. I looked at the man who had called me gold in the moonlight. I looked at the man who was my only way out of this house of hate. I took a deep breath. I do, I whispered. Then you are husband and wife, the pastor said, closing his book. Now go. I have other things to do. There was no applause. There was no cake. Uncle Bob didn't even give me a hug. He just pointed toward the gate. That's it. You're his problem now. Don't come back here asking for help when you're hungry. We're done with you. I picked up my small bundle of clothes, the only things I owned, and I walked toward the gate with David. My heart was heavy with the fear of the unknown, but as my foot stepped out of that compound for the last time, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was a beggar's wife wearing a rag of a dress, but I was finally free. I walked beside David, the dust of the road clinging to the stained hem of my yellowed dress. My heart was a drum, beating with every step I took away from the only home I had ever known. I looked at David's tattered coat and his worn-out shoes, and I wondered where we would sleep tonight. Would it be under a tree like my uncle said? Or would we walk until my feet bled, looking for a corner of a shed to call our own? Are you tired, Jane? David asked. He wasn't limping as much now. In fact, the further we got from my uncle's gate, the straighter he stood. I'm okay, I lied, clutching my small bundle of clothes tighter. I don't know where we are going. We are going home, he said. There was a smile in his voice that I couldn't understand. We reached the main road, a long stretch of asphalt that led away from our small town and toward the big city. I expected us to keep walking, but David stopped. He stood by the side of the road looking at his watch, a watch that looked much too expensive for a man in rags. Suddenly, I saw a flash of light in the distance. A large, sleek black sedan was driving toward us. It was the kind of car I had only seen in movies, with windows so dark you couldn't see who was inside. It moved silently like a ghost, and to my absolute shock, it pulled over right in front of us. I stepped back, terrified. David, we should move. We're in their way. But David didn't move. He stood his ground. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out wearing a crisp white shirt and a black suit. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to David, bowed his head deeply and opened the back door. Good afternoon, sir, the driver said. The plane is ready and the house has been prepared as you requested. I stood there with my mouth open, my mind spinning. Sir, the plane? I looked at David, waiting for him to tell the man he had made a mistake. But David just nodded. He reached up and took off that dusty, crooked hat, revealing a face that looked powerful and sharp. He pulled off the ragged coat to reveal a clean shirt underneath. Jane, he said, turning to me. His eyes were shining with a kindness I had never seen before. I told you that you were gold. And I told you that I would keep you safe. David, I don't understand, I whispered. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my bundle. My name is David King, he said softly. I am the CEO of King Group. I didn't come to your town because I was hungry for bread, Jane. I came because I was hungry for the truth. I needed to find someone who could see the man behind the rags. I needed to find a heart that wasn't for sale. He reached out and took my bundle from me, handing it to the driver as if it were a bag of diamonds. Then he held out his hand to me. The test is over, Jane. You are the only one who saw me. You are the only one who treated me like a human being when the world told you I was nothing. Now let me show you who you really are. He helped me into the back of the car. The seats were made of soft, smells like new leather, and the air inside was cool and sweet. As the car pulled away, I looked out the back window. I saw my small town disappearing into the distance. I saw the life of shadows, the kitchen floor, and the stained dress fading away. I was sitting beside a billionaire, a man who had chosen me out of everyone in the world. I wasn't a beggar's wife. I was a queen. The car ride was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing. I sat deep in the leather seat, looking down at my dirty, calloused hands resting against the luxury of the car. David sat beside me, no longer the man who limped, but a man who held the world in his palm. When we finally arrived, the gates opened to a house so large I thought it was a museum. There were fountains, rows of lights, and people standing at the door just to welcome us. Welcome home, Jane, David said, leading me inside. I felt out of place. My dress was still torn and my shoes were still dusty, but David held my hand like I was wearing silk. He led me to a large study filled with books, real books like the one I had seen him reading in the dark. He sat me down and poured 2 glasses of water, handing me one with that same respect he had shown me at the gate. "Jane," he began, his voice serious but gentle. "I know your head is spinning. You're wondering why a man like me would dress in rags and come to a house like yours. It wasn't just a random choice." I looked at him, my heart still racing. "Why David? Why my uncle? Why me?" He leaned back, a shadow crossing his face. 10 years ago my father was a different man. He was a successful builder, honest and hardworking. Your Uncle Bob was his business partner. They were working on a massive project, a deal that would have secured our family's future forever. But Uncle Bob was greedy. I felt a sink in my stomach. I knew my uncle was mean, but I didn't know he was a thief. "He forged my father's signature," David continued, his jaw tightening. "He stole the investment funds and moved the property into his own name. By the time my father realized what had happened, he was ruined. The stress, the shame of losing everything, it broke his heart. He died a year later, penniless." Tears pricked my eyes. I thought of my own parents, lost to the fire, and then I thought of David's father, lost to my uncle's greed. "I spent a decade rebuilding," David said. "I worked every job you can imagine until I turned 1 cent into $1 and then $1 into $1,000,000. I won Jane. I got back everything Bob took and more. But I wanted to see if the man who destroyed my father had changed. I wanted to see if his family had any light left in them." He looked me straight in the eyes. "I dressed as a beggar to see how Bob would treat a man who had nothing, just like he left my father with nothing. I saw the way he looked at me with disgust. I saw the way your aunt and cousins laughed at my pain. They were exactly who I thought they were." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "But then there was you. You had every reason to be bitter. You had been treated like a servant in your own home. Yet when I came to that gate, you were the only one who saw a human being. You gave me water when you had nothing to give. You spoke to me with honor when everyone else threw insults." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast gardens. "I came for the truth, Jane. And the truth I found is that Uncle Bob didn't deserve a second chance, but you deserved a whole new life. You were the only one who passed the test. You were the only one who kept your heart clean in a house full of mud." I sat there, the weight of his words sinking in. I wasn't just a bride. I was the answer to a 10-year-old prayer for justice. I realized then that my kindness wasn't a weakness. It was the very thing that had saved me. I spent a few days in that beautiful mansion, letting the peace sink into my bones. For the first time in my life, I woke up because the sun felt warm on my face, not because someone was screaming at me to get to work. But as I sat in those soft chairs, I kept thinking about the house I left behind. Not because I missed it, but because I knew I couldn't truly start my new life until I closed the door on the old one. "David," I said one morning, "I need to go back. Just for an hour." He didn't ask why. He just nodded, his eyes full of pride. "I'll have the car ready." This time when we drove into the village, it felt different. I wasn't the girl walking in the dust anymore. I sat in the back of that same black sedan, wearing a simple but elegant white dress. My hair was neat, and for the first time my skin glowed because I was finally resting. As we pulled up to the front gate of Uncle Bob's compound, the neighbors stopped what they were doing. People came out of their shops, pointing and whispering. They thought a government official or a movie star had arrived. The driver stepped out and opened my door. When I stepped onto the dirt, the silence was so loud you could hear the wind. Uncle Bob was sitting on his usual bench, looking older and more tired. Aunt Mary was at the window, and Kate and Rose ran out to the porch, their eyes wide with shock. They didn't recognize me at first. They just saw a lady in a luxury car. But as I walked closer and took off my sunglasses, I saw the moment they realized it was me. Aunt Mary actually dropped the glass she was holding. "Jane," Rose whispered, her voice trembling. Is that you?" I walked up to the porch. I didn't feel the fear I used to feel. I didn't feel the urge to hide in the shadows. I stood tall and looked at them. "It's me," I said. My voice was calm and steady. Uncle Bob stood up slowly, his face turning pale. He looked at the car, then at the driver, then back at me. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "How? That beggar," we thought. "His name is David King," I said. "And he was never a beggar. He was the son of the man you cheated 10 years ago. He came back to see if you had changed. He came back to see if there was any kindness left in this house. The shame that hit their faces was heavy. Kate and Rose looked at their feet, unable to meet my eyes. Aunt Mary looked like she wanted to run inside. They waited for me to scream. They waited for me to tell the driver to throw them out or to mock them the way they had mocked me. I didn't come here to hurt you, I said, looking at each of them. I came to tell you that I forgive you. All those years you made me sleep on the floor, all those names you called me. I'm leaving all of that here. I won't carry your hate into my future. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. I walked over to Uncle Bob and placed it in his shaky hands. This is for the house, I told him. Fix the roof. Repair the fence. Buy some food. I don't want to see my family living in a ruin, even if you were happy to let me live like a servant. Aunt Mary started to cry, not out of joy but out of the sheer weight of her own regret. I didn't wait for a thank you. I didn't need one. I turned around and walked back to the car with my head held high. As the car pulled away, I looked back one last time. I saw them standing there, small and frozen in the dust. I realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't making them suffer. It was showing them that their cruelty hadn't been enough to change who I was. I was Jane and I was finally free. As I sat back in the car and watched the village disappear for the last time, a weight lifted off my shoulders that I didn't even know I was carrying. David reached over and squeezed my hand, and for a long moment we just sat in the silence. I had gone back to face my past, and in doing so, I had finally stepped into my future. But as we pulled back into the driveway of the mansion, I realized that I couldn't just sit behind gold-colored gates and drink tea all day. I knew what it felt like to be hungry. I knew what it felt like to be told you were worth nothing. David, I said as we walked through the front doors. I am grateful for all of this. For the soft bed, the warm food, and the peace. But I can't be the only one who gets a happy ending. There are so many girls like I was, girls hiding in the shadows of houses where nobody loves them. David smiled, and I could see that he had been waiting for me to say this. I know, Jane. What do you want to do? That was the beginning of my real life's work. We didn't just spend our money on more cars or bigger houses. Instead, we bought a large piece of land not far from the town. We built a place called the Heart Center. It wasn't a cold institution or a gray building. It was a home with wide windows, bright gardens, and rooms filled with sewing machines, computers, and books. I spent my days there. I didn't walk around like a boss. I sat on the floor with the girls. I talked to the orphans who had lost their parents just like I did. I held the hands of the women who had been treated like servants. I looked them in the eyes and told them the same thing David told me. You are gold. I made sure they learned skills so they would never have to depend on people like Uncle Bob ever again. We taught them how to bake, how to sew, how to run businesses, and how to speak up for themselves. Every time I saw a girl stand a little taller or smile for the first time in years, I felt a joy that all the money in the world couldn't buy. One evening, after a long day at the center, David and I stood on the balcony of our home. The stars were out and the air was cool. I looked down at the simple silver necklace David had given me. It didn't have a giant diamond, it just had one word carved into it. Seen. You know, I whispered, leaning my head on his shoulder. For a long time I hated my life. I hated that I lost my parents. I hated that I had to scrub those floors and eat on the kitchen floor. I thought I was cursed. David pulled me closer. And now I realize that my curse was actually my greatest blessing, I said. If I hadn't gone through that fire, I wouldn't be the woman I am today. I wouldn't have the strength to help these women. I wouldn't have known how to recognize a good heart when I saw one. The shadows made me appreciate the light. I thought back to that girl in the yellowed, torn dress, standing at the gate with a bundle of rags. She was gone, but she lived on in the work I was doing. I wasn't just Jane the orphan or Jane the billionaire's wife. I was Jane, the woman who turned her pain into a bridge for others. My story didn't end with a wedding or a big car. It ended with a purpose. And as I looked out at the dark hills in the distance, I knew that no matter how dark the night gets, the sun always finds a way to rise for those who keep their hearts clean. I am no longer the girl in the shadows. I am Jane, a woman who found that the greatest wealth isn't held in a billionaire's bank account, but in a heart that remains clean despite the mud thrown at it. Remember, no matter how dark your night feels, the sun is already preparing to rise. You are gold. Never let the world tell you otherwise. Thank you for sitting with us through Jane's incredible journey on Gentle Stories. If this story touched your heart, Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth today. Before you go, I have a question for you. If you were in Jane's shoes, would you have been able to forgive Uncle Bob and Aunt Mary? Or would you have walked away forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next cinematic folktale. Until next time, keep your heart clean and your light shining. Goodbye.